What's up guys, my name is Takeyah. I'm an orthodontic assistant, and in today's video I'm going to go over the pros and the cons as a traveling orthodontic assistant. I do orthodontic and dental videos every Tuesday, and I also do content with my family every Friday, so make sure you subscribe so you don't miss out. All right, let's go. So I am no longer a traveling orthodontic assistant. Where I currently work, we have one location and I work there every day. But prior to working at this location, I was a traveling orthodontic assistant. The previous practice that I worked for, we had 4 different locations. So I was required to work at all 4 locations, and the schedule was different every week. So we worked Monday through Thursday. We had a different office every day. And sometimes we had the same office back to back. Like for example, we would work at one location Tuesday and Wednesday. It really varied. So I'm gonna start with the cons and then I'll start with the pros. Starting off with the cons, one thing that I had to do, I had to wake up really early. So whenever we traveled, we would open up the office and see patients at 8:30. Typically, most offices may do 8 o'clock or 8:15, but we always seen our first patients at 8:30 whenever we had to travel to an office that was far. If we were going to our furthest location, which was about an hour, we would see the first patient at 9 o'clock. But all of the other offices, we would see the first patient at 8:30. So I would have to wake up like at 5:30, 5 o'clock. And I still wake up early now because I'm just used to waking up that early. But when I had to travel, even though I woke up at 5:30, 5 o'clock, I had to leave my house at 6. I lived about 15 minutes away, and I had to be at the main location at 6:45, which was about 6:45. And sometimes when we were traveling really far, it was 6:30. So I only gave myself maybe an hour or 30 minutes to get ready just because I had to wake up so early and really have enough time to relax, and plus I didn't want to wake up no earlier than 5. Another con is that we would get home late some days. So usually on an average, I would get home like at 5:30, 6 o'clock. That was a normal day for travel. But whenever we traveled to the furthest location, which was about an hour, I would get out at 6 o'clock, 6:15, and I wouldn't get home until 7 or 6:45, like 6:45. And that was a really long day. So that's something that I had to get used to. But thankfully, we were not required and we did not travel to the furthest location every day. So I only had long days once or twice a week. And being that we had 4 different locations, we didn't keep each location stocked really heavy because it was somewhat pointless because we traveled to a different location every day. So with that being said, we would carry and pack our supplies and instruments that we would need every day. That was really exhausting. So when we got there in the morning at the location, we would have to unload the car. When it was time to pack up and leave and get on the road, we would have to pack everything inside the car. And we didn't pack everything. We just packed something. So we did keep a few items and instruments at certain locations, but we didn't keep a lot of things. So we were packing and unpacking at every location. So that just became, it became a lot. But I did get used to it over time. But that is just something you have to remember. This is a personal con. So whenever we traveled, sometimes the doctor would drive. So whenever the doctor drove, it was the doctor driving and then the assistant inside the car. So it was only awkward to me because I was still getting to know the doctor, and I have like a really shy personality when I'm getting to know people. So it was just really awkward in the beginning. But over time, we got used to driving with the doctor and it just became normal. We had two doctors, and one doctor just drove all the time whenever we traveled, and the other doctor didn't drive. So we didn't have to drive with the doctor every day, but when a certain doctor worked, he always drove. We drove with this doctor like maybe 2 to 3 times a week. And whenever the other doctor that didn't drive was on vacation, we was driving with this doctor the entire week. So that was something to get used to. I know a lot of assistants may not be close to the doctors and they don't have that type of relationship. So it can be kind of awkward. But then if you do become close with your doctor, it can be, a relaxed ride. Whenever the doctor that worked who did not drive, we, the assistants, had to drive. So we had one van that was a work van, and whenever the assistants were required to drive, we would rotate. So that's a con. So I had to drive. I don't mind driving, but I found myself tired some days. Like I told you before, we have one location that was an hour out. So sometimes I had to drive that hour drive there or back. We would always take turns, but it's not something that is expected. Like usually I expect, either to have someone else driving or I drive my own personal car. But I was required to drive some days. And when I drove, I was driving the work van with all of the other assistants and all of the supplies in the car. I'm like, oh my goodness, I had to drive this big work van. I don't drive big cars. I never drove a big van like this. It was really nervous in the beginning. But once I drove it, it felt just like my SUV. I do drive an SUV, but I've never driven like a van. So I had to drive that some days. And also whenever we had to travel to a location that was 45, 30 minutes or an hour, we would meet at the main location and carpool in the van. So when I said I had to wake up at 5 to meet at 6:30, we were meeting at the main location to carpool in the van. So another con as a traveling orthodontic assistant was I could not leave for any emergencies. So being that we all carpooled in the work van and the offices was about 45 to 30 minutes and one was an hour away, I couldn't just up and go and up and leave and take my keys and drive my car and go. So whenever I traveled to locations that was far, I made sure that my husband was available for any emergencies or just being available to possibly get my son from school. That's one thing I could not just up and do. If I did have an emergency, thankfully I never had that happen. I probably would have just gotten a phone call and then my husband would have taken care of any emergency that was needed. I couldn't just like up and leave and take the work van because the work van was, a community van and everybody drove together. That's what we used to pack and bring supplies. So that was never really an option. So that's one con that was a big adjustment. Another con is that each office that we traveled to had different equipment. So this practice that I have worked for has been around for a long time. So we had 4 locations and some locations were really old and some locations were really new. In the old locations, we had different equipment. We had one location where we had to still develop our x-rays in the darker room. That was just a big adjustment because I never could remember the steps because we only took x-rays every so often. So when I did have to take an x-ray, and if we were in the old location, I had to literally remember the steps or ask for help because I didn't take those x-rays all the time. And this was only one location where we had old x-rays. And we had a total of 4 locations. So the remaining 3 were all new x-rays and they all were the same. So I was doing x-rays more frequently with the new machines versus the old one. Whenever we traveled to the old location, we would take the x-ray, have to dip it in that liquid, hang it up, let it dry, re-dip, close the door, make sure the room is dark. It was really old school. That was the only big difference in equipment, was the x-ray machines. So I know those were a lot of cons, but now I'm going to get over into the pros. So being a traveling orthodontic assistant is not all bad. So one pro is that you get long hours, and with the long hours you get more pay. So typically as an orthodontic assistant, you're averaging about 30 to 32 hours a week. But as a traveling orthodontic assistant, I was averaging to about 36 to almost 40. And that was making my check, really big. And I had a lot of extra money at that point in time. Another pro as a traveling orthodontic assistant, in my office that I was working at, we were clocking in as soon as we got to the main location before we took off on the road to drive. So that was really, really nice. So whenever we got to the main location, we immediately clocked in. So we were clocked in and we were on the clock as soon as we started packing up the van and as we're traveling and driving to the location. And we did not clock out until we got back to the main location and drove all the way back. So mind you, we were getting a lot of hours. Like I said before, we had one office that was an hour away, one that was 45, one that was 30. So when I would get to the main location at 6:30, 6:45, I was clocking in. On days where the office was 30 minutes, I was clocking out like 5:15. When we traveled to an office that was 45 minutes away, I was clocking out like 5:30, maybe 5:45. When we traveled to the hour location, I was clocking out 6, maybe 6:15. So I was getting all of that time. So it kind of doesn't make traveling bad because, you're being compensated for traveling. So it's really not all that bad. Another pro as a traveling orthodontic assistant is that I was saving money on gas. I didn't have to worry about driving my own vehicle and getting mileage on my car. So we were giving the option, if you wanted to drive your own personal vehicle, but it was always made known and always available that you can carpool with the work van. We did have some assistants who traveled with their own vehicles and they ran up their own mileage on their own car. So that was just a choice that you had, but I never did that. I felt like it was no need. If I had transportation available, I'm going to take advantage of it. We worked with really great doctors. If you ever decided to drive your own personal car and you had more than one assistant in your vehicle, they would compensate you for gas on those days. So we did have some assistants that drove together all the time because they lived closer near certain locations. So whenever we worked at a location that they lived next to, they would drive their own personal vehicle, and sometimes we had some assistants who lived next to each other, so they would carpool. Whenever that happened, the doctors would compensate them for gas and the mileage. So I thought that was really sweet. Like, the doctors that I worked with was really great. So they made traveling as an orthodontic assistant really great, really comfortable. I know I did list a lot of cons, but all of those cons kind of don't matter when you consider the pros that I mentioned and when you consider working for great doctors. So if you ever have the opportunity to travel as an orthodontic assistant, don't shy away from it just because you'll be traveling to multiple locations and it'll be long hours. Because if you're being compensated for those long hours and if you're working for great doctors, it really is a great position. Well, go ahead and comment any questions you may have. Like this video, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.